Now, as we move into a new age of landscape painting, we encounter another of the great Sung masters of landscape, that is Li Tang, and another, fortunately, from whom we have a major, large, reliable work, signed work, and moreover with a date. We'll see several other paintings associated with Li Tang, and we'll see one with an old attribution to a different artist, which was long ago reattributed to Li Tang by myself and published as his work. We're going to see several signed and reliable works also by followers of Li Tang, which means that we can not only construct an oeuvre or a body of extant work for the artist himself, but we can also chart his following through 2 generations probably. This is all very new, and it allows a kind of art historical neatness that I haven't been able to do in the earlier lectures. It's a neat enough pattern even to allow us to reject as Li Tang's work a couple of paintings, very fine paintings, which have one of them with I think an interpolated Li Tang signature, which for many years were taken to be the work of Li Tang, and big arguments went on about whether they could possibly be by him. You'll see it. This is the Kotu in landscapes, and I believe they belong much later, around the end of Sung. And I'm also going to begin showing in this lecture photos of real landscape, real scenery, just to show how the artists were able to transform what they saw in nature into artistic forms. All these pleasures and revelations, I hope they're that anyway, are waiting for you in what follows. It is Lecture 9A. I'll give a bit of history before we go on looking at the paintings as before. Beginning with the periods that preceded this, that is the Northern Sung, from the late 10th to the early 12th centuries. The strength of the Northern Sung administration had been the civil service, the examination system by which people, men, attained official rank through examinations. The ideal type of scholar, statesman, cultural figure had been established in the Northern Sung. Men who were successful in the exams, that is, who were appointed to government service in the capital or in the provinces, and they were rotated from position to position. The greatest height of prosperity was reached in this period, that is, the earlier part of the Northern Sung. But in the late Northern Sung, there was a general decline in the government, brought about mainly by the attempted reforms of a prime minister, or the equivalent of prime minister, Wang Ximeng, 1021 to 1086, a person about whom there's obviously strong differences of opinion, depending on how you judge his attempts at reform. He favored government interventions in the economy, control of trade, something he called the ever-normal granary, which stocked grain when it was plentiful and then dispensed it when it was scarce. Controlled economy. He wanted to make the exam system more slanted toward practical ability instead of just knowledge of the classics. He was for government loans to farmers and so on. Well, he met with an entrenched bureaucracy, and his reforms were, in effect, nullified by the reaction of this conservative backlash. Excuse me, this is the winter of 1909 to 10. Excuse me if I think of poor Barack Obama up against the Republicans in Congress. Okay, anyway. So this Republican backlash included people who we saw as artists and calligraphers last time, such as the great Su Shi or Su Dongpo and Mi Fu and others. They were part of this conservative faction. Okay. Then under the last emperor of the Northern Sung, Huizong, what had been difficulty turned to disaster. He ascended the throne in 1101 at the age of 19. He was an aesthetic emperor. He had associated with artists and litterateurs and others in his youth. The brilliance of his court and his extravagances further exhausted the empire, and there were peasant uprisings and other troubles. The Grand Counselor, the Prime Minister in our term, this time a man named Cai Jing, appointed in 1102, dismissed, reappointed, and so on, finally dismissed in 1120. He was another reformer, like Wang Ximeng, trying to reform education, the economy, agriculture, and so on. Huizong, on the other hand, was increasingly obsessed with music and Taoism and other matters that caused him to neglect his rule. Now, all this is the old interpretation from books from, the 1950s and so on. In other words, things I read when I was teaching. New books can take a very different stand, and I definitely recommend them to your attention. In the next lecture on bird and flower painting, when I talk about the painting of the Emperor Huizong and his court, I will recommend very strongly recent books by Professor Patricia Ebry, University of Washington, and Maggie Bickford, a respected colleague in the field of Chinese art history. So what I'm saying is, I say, very old-fashioned, and we believe they're more reliable than I. Meanwhile, the Jurchens, who were nomadic people who originally lived up beyond the Liao, the Khitans, that is outside of what we think of as China proper, had rebelled against the Liao, and the Sung dynasty allied with the Jurchens against what they took to be the common enemy, the Liao. And after the Liao was put down or driven out, the Jurchens simply moved in and captured Kaifeng, the capital of the north, in 1126. Huizong was taken prisoner. The northern Sung dynasty ended. Battles continued between the Chinese and the Jurchens, and eventually the Huai River, a river that runs through more or less the center of China, with the Yellow River above and the Yangtze River below. Anyway, the Huai River was taken as the boundary between the two. The Jin dynasty, as the Jurchens called their rule. The Jurchen capital was located at Peking, or Beijing, in 1153. Now, in 1135, the Sung Emperor Gaozong, who succeeded Huizong, fled down to the south to Nanking, and first established the capital there, and then in 1138 established a new capital at Linan, which in modern Hangzhou, down below the Yangtze River. A great general named Yue Fei was trying to continue the fight against the Jurchens, but he was recalled, executed, and a really ignoble peace was established in 1141. There's still a shrine to him on the shores of the West Lake in Hangzhou, where you can go. Here is a view of the modern city of Hangzhou, seen from a nearby hill across the West Lake. The location of the Imperial Palace was around the upper middle of this image, or a bit to the right of that. Before it, and the great scenic attraction of the city, is the West Lake itself, a man-made shallow lake divided by man-made dikes with bridges under which the boats can pass, and islands. Very famous scenery, known to everybody in China, more or less. Next, please. Looking the other way, we see these famous dikes and islands. Boating on the West Lake, where noisy motorboats are banned, has been one of the pleasures of Hangzhou from Sung times until now. The southern Sung, which lasted nearly 2 centuries longer, although it was politically weak and geographically cramped or constricted, was very prosperous, and the Painting Academy flourished, produced great masters, as we'll see, and we have a great age of painting, actually, for the next 2 centuries in this constricted area down in the south. I'll also show some things from the north, from the Jin dynasty, but separately. In an earlier lecture, I recommended highly, as an aid to understanding what happened in Chinese culture during the Sung dynasty, the book by Peter Ball, titled This Culture of Ours, Intellectual Transitions in Tang and Sung China, published in 1992. I still recommend it highly, but now I have an addition to make. At a professional meeting in Honolulu last March, I ran into Peter Ball, and I spoke briefly with him, telling him how much I still thought of his book. He was pleased, but he said also that he has a more recent book I should buy and read, the one now on screen, Neo-Confucianism in History. I've acquired this, and I'm reading it. Those who have watched the previous lectures know how I want to see the big development of Sung painting, especially the rise of a monumental landscape tradition, against a background of Neo-Confucian thought. So for those of you seriously interested in this subject, I recommend this book without having finished reading it all the way through myself. Before I show and talk about the paintings by the first great major landscapist of the Southern Song Academy, that is Li Tang, I want to show two handscrolls that were done under Huizong, or in the one case, the second one shortly after Huizong. The first of these is by an artist named Wang Ximeng, and who was born in 1096 and died in 1119. And the painting, A Long Handscroll, was done when he was only 18 years old. Brilliant young man. And it was inscribed. You see the inscription here at the left of this these two reproductions, inscribed by Cai Jing, the prime minister, in 1113, and it was made to present to the emperor. The painting is titled A Thousand Li of Rivers and Mountains, and it's in the Palace Museum in Beijing. It's 12 meters long and done in bright colors on silk. Well, this reproduction you're seeing now was published in China Pictorial, a picture magazine, and it's all we knew of the painting for a long time. So when we went to Beijing, this must have been in the 1973 delegation, we were very excited about seeing this painting. We asked for it especially because this made it look so great. I can only say the painting was a strange kind of disappointment. Let's have the next slides, please. Here's a section of it, an actual slide, which shows the brilliant blue and green colors that are used throughout the painting. They must have given this young man real pots of blue and green mineral pigments. And of course, this produces a landscape that not only has archaistic tones, that is, references to the past, back to the powerful Tang Dynasty when blue and green landscape was used, but also signifies a prosperous, fruitful realm and flatters Huizong by association, by symbolically, so to speak. So it was very much a political move to paint this kind of landscape and present it to the emperor. But you can see here in the detail, here's a detail close-up of some boats and people. The drawing of the boats and people is really pretty dull. Nothing happens. They're all just stock figures. And the boats are not very interesting. And the trees are painted without any particular interest. And throughout the painting, that's true. Here's a couple more sections showing a house. Now, what we found is this. It was really quite funny and strange. The first 5 or 6 feet or so of the painting, maybe 2 meters, whatever. The painting, as I said, is 12 meters long. No, I didn't say that. Very long. Okay. The first 2 meters or so showed some sign of wear, as though it had been repeatedly rolled and unrolled. But after that, after you rolled for maybe 5 or 6 feet, it was as if it were brand new, like it was painted yesterday. In other words, over the centuries, people had rolled a bit and then realized it was not really very interesting and then stopped rolling. And the latter parts of it were just terribly fresh and new. Well, as we rolled, it became, as I say, more and more apparent that this young man had worked hard but didn't have much real talent and didn't have much imagination, and put very standard stock elements into his painting, houses and figures and so on, and used a lot of this brilliant color, but no, didn't really produce a very interesting painting. Okay, that was certainly our opinion. On the other hand, a recent major multi-volume series of books on Chinese painting published in China, the Zhonghua Minghua Chuanji, or Chinese famous painting complete collection, in their volume on Song painting devotes no less than 25 color plates of this scroll. This is far more than any other artist or painting gets in this series. Well, I think the decision to devote so much to it depended on this question of imperial approval, Huizong's and Cai Jing's inscription and the association with this famous emperor, and the inscriptions and the authenticity and so on. In other words, this was a book reader's choice to devote that much space and beautiful color plates to it, not by any means the decision of a painting looker. a painting looker would have chosen the painting we're about to see next, handscrolls that for me is far more interesting. But this painting, attributed to Zhao Boju, gets only a couple plates in this publication, long sections of it don't really show much. And generally, this painting, Zhao Boju painting, has not been published anywhere that I know of in plates that really show how fine a painting it really is. Okay, now we're going to spend more time looking at that. Zhao Boju, who died around 1162, was a, well, let me talk about the painting a little bit before I come to him. The painting carries a colophon, an inscription mounted after the painting itself, written by some early Ming mounters. And according to this inscription, a group of early Ming painting mounters discovered this painting and presented it to the emperor. They recognized it, that is, as a major work, an important work by this famous artist Zhao Boju. It isn't actually signed, but it's a fairly convincing attribution. This is a scroll titled Autumn Colors Over Rivers and Mountains, and is a long hand scroll. Well, as I say, for picture lookers, as opposed to book readers, it's a far more interesting work, and I'm going to spend more time on it. Okay, here we go. We knew the painting briefly or distantly from black and white reproductions that were published in Suren's book. Here's a general long section of it, not at all photographed by me. I couldn't make sections like this. I had to photograph it in a hand scroll case behind glass using my flash, and of course nothing like this is possible. This is from some reproduction. Well, as you see, the painting, it looks odd and maybe not all that great from the reproductions like this. And as I say, we saw it in something like this in Suren's book. And in other words, a bunch of wiggly-looking mountains or hills rising up, cliffs and so forth, twisting from a far middle ground, and then various things going on down below, buildings and figures and so on, and two water courses, rivers, streams, whatever, coming out of the middle ground and flowing into the foreground to divide this extended foreground. Now that, of course, should remind you of the Emperor Ming's long journey to Shu, the painting copied after an early Tang work, which I talked about at length, and I talked about Tang landscape. Here it is. Now, when you look at it, you see that essentially it's the same thing. That is to say, twisting and strange peaks rising up in a kind of far middle ground, and then a foreground with figures and other things, horses and mules and so forth, divided by two streams that flow into the foreground, which way they're flowing is beside the point, but which divide the middle ground. So there's something really, something the artist took from paintings like this, maybe this very painting, to make his picture archaistic. Now here are sections of the Zhao Boju attributed picture, again taken by someone else. As you see, a number of buildings and figures and trees in the foreground, and then up and among the hills, various buildings and clusters of buildings. So it begins to look more interesting, but it's still nothing much there until you begin looking at details. Okay, now here is a reproduction again, a slide from a reproduction. The color is all wrong, of the beginning of the scroll, and at least it shows us what the beginning of the scroll looks like, even though it's not a very good slide. It presents a broad river valley flowing out of the distance into the foreground, and again, figures and under trees and so on in the foreground. And then along the banks, clusters of buildings, villages, whatever, built along the shores. And on the left, these twisting, continuous ridges and mountains begin, overhanging strongly, overhanging over the houses below, looking rather dramatic and so on. Now, when we come in, next please, here's a detail of the houses on the shore. Well, it's obviously more interesting than the Wang Ximeng scroll in the sense that it really, the shoreline recedes convincingly, and the trees are convincingly diminished as you go into distance. And there are geese on the shore here you see, and the houses and so on. And then we go in closer here. Next slide, and next image, I mean. And here is the cluster of buildings. And you see things are really happening. People are inside and outside the fence, and people are communing and so forth. And the buildings are drawn by somebody who's interested in how they are done. All right, now we will go on. What I can show you will be mainly details, and I won't even try to locate them in the whole composition. I can't do that. I don't have good slides of the whole composition. Here's another side of one of the sections, which at least shows us what the whole scroll looks like. That is, it's on fairly dark silk with fairly heavy blue and green color, which, however, instead of solidly covering the form, simply is applied to parts of them on forms that are otherwise quite volumetric, treated with up-to-date ways of indicating volume and upper and lower sides and so on. I couldn't do this, even this slide, without getting bad reflection down at the bottom. As I say, it's really impossible to photograph a painting in a hand scroll painting in a case. But let's go on and look at details, and we'll see gradually what makes this scroll interesting. Here is a section of the a detail of the from the lower part of the scroll early on, and we see a man with a broad hat riding a donkey through the landscape under the pine trees. Beyond are mists floating through the trees and a few flowering trees in the foreground. This seems to be early spring. There's actually snow on the trees in some places. And up above him, steps going up to a walled compound, a house. Okay, the next. Here we come in closer. Okay, the artist uses the colors quite skillfully to model the forms and to give space and to render the mists. The mists floating through the trees are quite beautifully rendered and so forth. Okay, now another section, another foreground. Here, a group of figures, a whole group of them making their way through the landscape, across a bridge, a kind of covered wagon, ox carts, donkeys again, and figures, and flowering trees and other trees beyond. And then you begin to see up above the people making their way up into the upper part of this painting. Here again, next please. Here are the figures, two men, high-class men, merchants, who knows, whatever, making their way with their servant, who's carrying the luggage as usual in front of them. The two of them are turning toward each other, and in winter landscapes, in cold landscapes, this is often true. You see two travelers, and they look toward each other as though they're kind of almost huddling together, figuratively. We see this in a painting we'll see later by Liang Kai, a marvelous winter landscape by him. Similarly. Okay, then next please. Or here's a detail in which one of these mule trains has paused to rest, and the mules are being allowed to graze and to lie down by their grooms. And meanwhile, the other people are sleeping or resting under the pine trees. In other words, interesting narrative details and a lot going on in the picture. Okay, here is one of the longer sections which shows one of these two water courses, streams, whatever you'd call them, flowing out of the middle ground into the foreground. And where it originates, as you see, is a hollow, a kind of overhanging cave-like hollow with a waterfall falling into it. And all around it, these twisting bluffs and hills and villas off on the left and so forth. Now, as you move in closer, the next, please. Here we go. This is a vertical slide that shows what's happening in the foreground. So in other words, you're moving back from a foreground that has trees and travelers and bridges and so forth into things going on in the middle ground, and then up from that, up into the upper part where still quite a lot is going on, as we'll see. Now moving in still further. When you get really into this cave-like space and where the waterfall is, you see it's really, really quite interesting. A group of people here are standing on the shore. 3 men with their servant, 2 of the men, one of the men pointing at the waterfall for a reason I never understood. When you have people gazing at a waterfall, one of them is usually pointing at the waterfall, as if saying, look, there's the waterfall. I don't know what the reason for that is, but it's a Chinese convention anyway, and we find it over and over. And if you look a little to the right of these men, barely visible because the pigment has come off, you see the figure of another man seated on the shore, dangling his feet in the water. And then the quite beautiful waterfall itself and the pine tree, done with heavy green color, and other bare trees with a little bit of snow up to the left. Anyway, a really interesting scene, as we have throughout this painting. You can see here, by the way, for the first time, I think, that the artist has used strokes of gold along the contours of some of the landscape forms to give a kind of sheen or light or whatever is like sunlight striking them. Okay, going on. Here's another large section. As I say, I'm going through and showing details of this painting to show just what the quality of it is, what makes it interesting, without being able to fit them all into some large scheme. Somebody else will have to do that sometime when the painting is really properly published, as it hasn't been. Okay, here, figures making their way toward a cluster of houses in the foreground through bamboo, and then up above that, several people making their way up, starting to walk up the stairs toward a compound seen in the upper left. And then in the upper right here, we see a traveler with a broad hat and his servant pausing on the path, making his way up toward some other settlement, whatever, to look into a ravine, maybe another waterfall there. So things are going on all over, and one moves in imagination through the painting and climbs and penetrates the spaces and so on to see these figures. All right, next please. Further up, this is the place where a man and his servant have walked through a gateway with a fence and are about to climb the steps on their way up to this compound. And you see it with a courtyard and somebody standing inside. And you see it with galleries, whatever you would call them, open rooms facing out so that people can eat or drink there and gaze out over the scenery. Well, there's something like this at the end of the great Shaogui scroll that we'll see much later in Lecture 11. It's probably some kind of inn in the mountains where people can stop. Okay, next please. And here is the section where you see the traveler on a mule with his broad hat, pausing to look into a ravine and pointing as though he's seeing something there. We don't know what. All bits of mystery and bits of drama and so on all through the painting. Now here's a slide, next please, which I show just to show how the landscape forms are rendered in this remarkable work. Here down at the bottom is a place where the action of water flowing out of the distance presumably, has eroded the rocks and into strange shapes, pitted, penetrated even. There's a place in the on the shore of the Taihu, the Great Lake in Jiangsu province, where rocks of this kind are so interesting that they're cut out and transported to gardens and set up as a kind of sculpture, so-called Taihu Shi. Well, this is that kind of rock, but eroded by water. And you see here also the use of this rather spare use of green and blue color, to not covering the whole forms, not flat, as in the Emperor Minghuang and so on, but used on forms that are otherwise rendered quite convincingly and volumetrically up to date. The next, please. Yeah, here is a mountain, just to show these mountain ridges and how powerfully and dramatically they are rendered, and the rather sparing use of the heavy green and blue colors. This is a blue and green landscape of a kind that we scarcely see later. The typical paintings attributed to Zhao Boju are usually just with flat applications of blue and heavy blue and green color. These are decorative paintings, and they exist by the thousands. I didn't say earlier that pictures attributed to Zhao Boju are just endless, because painters of later times who did pictures of this decorative kind liked to write his name on them. His his style name was Chen Li, 1,000 li, 1,000 miles. And I actually bought one of them when I was an officer in Seoul, Korea, in the occupation in the 1940s. And it was one of 3 album paintings that started my career as a Chinese painting specialist even. That's another story. At any rate, there are millions of them, but they're nothing at all like this. This is the real thing. This is what Zhao Boju might have painted. A major landscape master working in the academy, working in the 12th century, and using the blue-green style in a completely different way than we thought. Here's another slide of just showing how a large mass can be treated as a whole. Its face toward us, receding sides, something like texture strokes, but not much. Very, very sparsely used. And okay, here we go. Now again, yes, here is a detail of another cluster of buildings up in the mountains, and a man entering a gate. It's a walled city, or no, village, or whatever. Maybe it's just a single cluster of family dwellings. I don't know what it's meant to be. Somebody else can do that kind of study of this painting, and it would be very interesting indeed. And then another road goes from this up to the upper right here, and through a gate that you see. Next, please. Here's a quite wonderful slide of a passage in the mountains where a covered walkway is built along the cliff to allow visitors to come to the cluster of buildings in the upper left. It goes through a covered bridge over a ravine with a waterfall. Quite dramatic and wonderful. And then further over here on the left, we see a figure who has made his way through this walkway and is now climbing the steps to get to this villa. It's as though, that is, people have villas and retirement homes, whatever, up in the hills, and other people can go there to visit them or whatever. Okay, next. Here's a detail showing again the green color and a path built along the cliff, and a figure. As in other paintings, the heavy pigment on the figures has largely come off, and this exists only as a kind of white image now. Now, going down below, I'm getting near the end. I really love this scroll, and I want to show some of the best places in it. Here's a passage where a man, seen a little bit to the right of the middle, is making his way along the path. He's come over the bridge, and he's coming into the foreground in a bamboo grove, and a stream that flows from the middle distance into the foreground, and bamboo diminishing in size. You go back a little bit of snow on the trees further on, blossoming trees. It is, as I say, early spring. And finally here, last slide. I like this one. Here particularly, you can see the seasonal indications. On the one hand, bits of snow still lying on the branches of the trees, and on the other hand, blossoming trees and a red camellia, is it? Anyway, whatever, down here in the lower left, indicating that it's early spring. And 3 impressive figures again, men of some stature and their servant, turning to each other and about to enter what seems to be some kind of a shrine. And you can see inside the darkened interior of the shrine, quite wonderfully depicted. Okay, and up above, pine trees. Now, for visitors, viewers of the time, these details meant more than they do to us, or at least to me, because they must have known what kind of shrine this was and why the men were visiting it in early spring. And they had much more sense of what was going on in the picture. And if we think about how people read the painting or saw it, You have to realize that they had it. They didn't have to look at it in a glass case. They had it in front of them on a table, and they would be seated and rolling the scroll from their right hand from their left hand into their right hand, gradually moving gradually leftward over the surface of the scroll, and enjoying details. They had to be pretty sharp-eyed to see all this, but the way they enjoyed it might be not too unlike the way I've tried to present it. That is, seeing all these interesting things going on in it, all this in a spatially unified and, so to speak, geologically unified setting. Okay, quite a wonderful painting, and I haven't really said much about the artist, but let me do that before we go on. Zhao is an academy master who served under Huizong in Huizong's academy, and then he became one of the next emperor, Gaozong's favorite painters, in the newly founded Southern Song Academy in the south. His specialty, as I say, was blue and green landscapes. We saw already examples of that in the Northern Song, one by Wang Ximeng, for instance, who was a kind of aristocrat amateur painter. Li Tang, we'll see, also did blue and green landscape. We'll see an example by him. So this represents some absorption of literati taste or scholar amateur taste into painting in the academy. This taste for antiquity and for old styles. Zhao Boju himself was another distant member of the Sung imperial family. He held some posts other than as a painter. He was the keeper of the imperial seal and so on. And as I say, there are thousands of paintings attributed to him, but this is the only one that makes much sense as a work of the time and by a great master. I don't know of any other paintings attributed to Zhao Boju that have any chance to be genuine, but there is a fine scroll in the Palace Museum in Beijing that's attributed to his younger brother, Zhao Bosu. He held an official position as defense commissioner. He wasn't, that is, a proper academy artist, but was a person of some higher rank who painted. Like his brother, he specialized in landscapes in the blue and green manner that evoked the Tang. The scroll is unsigned. It's ascribed to Zhao Bosu and a colophon by Zhao Mengfu of the early Yuan period. There's also a colophon by another Yuan master, Nizan, and seals of famous collectors. The scroll is very much appreciated over the centuries. The opening passage, seen here, presents an arresting image of the sun rising over the sea, with two cranes seen flying over the water, and a rocky shore with pine trees growing on it. I haven't read anything that suggests a specific subject for the painting, but it's obviously an auspicious subject, and I strongly suspect that it's an illustration to the poem from the Book of Odes titled Tian Bao Jiu Ru, Heaven Protects the Nine Likenesses, a poem wishing blessings on the recipient, or the person to whom the poem is addressed. Next images, please. We'll see in a later lecture this painting by Ma Hezhi, a slightly later artist who also worked in the imperial court, and whose major works are illustrations to the Book of Odes, with the text written out by the emperor under whom he served. This is the Tian Bao Jiu Ru ode, and his illustration for it. The first stanza of the ode reads this way. Heaven protects and establishes thee, so that in everything thou dost prosper, like the high hills and the mountain masses, like the topmost ridges and the greatest bulks, that, as the stream ever coming on, such is thine increase. The second stanza of the poem reads, like the moon advancing to the full, like the sun ascending the heavens, like the age of the southern hills, never waning, never falling, like the luxuriance of the fir and the cypress, may such be thy succeeding line. They're wishing blessings, that is, of many sons and grandsons and so on, a whole lineage of prosperous people following the person to whom the poem is addressed. Well, this is one of many paintings I could show illustrating this ode. The Tian Bao Jiu Ru theme becomes a favorite one for artists of the Ming-Qing period doing auspicious pictures for presentation on birthdays, whatever. You can see one by the late Ming artist Wang Ximeng, for instance, in Seren, Volume 6, Plate 299. Now, when we return to the scroll ascribed to Zhao Bosu, Next, please. We see the sun ascending the heavens, the coniferous trees, maybe fir and cypress, and the beginning of distant peaks that could be intended to represent the southern hills. I'm not absolutely sure of this interpretation, but it seems likely. I would have to check it against the colophones, which probably mention the subject. I don't have easy access to them. Next. Further on in the scroll, the mountains continue in the distance. The rich green of the trees turns into large areas of green foliage or bushes. The shoreline below is seen hollowed out by the action of the waves, and a road appears above, here in the upper right, leading down into the trees toward the temple buildings, of which the roofs are seen over the trees. The hollowing of the shore culminates in a cave, and more temple roofs appear in the upper left, now surrounded by clouds. They are probably the roofs of a Taoist temple in this context. Everything in the picture is richly mysterious. White birds, cranes or egrets are seen flying over the trees, with a flight of them to the right of the cave. A rocky bluff in the upper left continues beyond the upper limit of the scroll. The otherworldly effect of all this makes viewing the scroll a strange and moving experience. Whether or not it's by Zhao Bosu, it belongs to the kind of poetic painting being practiced by aristocratic semi-amateurs in his time. The next, please, the last. As the scroll ends, distant peaks appear again against the sky in the upper part, while below a near shore rises with tall pine trees growing on it, along with smaller trees under them. Many birds are seen in flight, and a bridge crosses the river, leading into the clouds and presumably toward the temples. And to complete the auspicious imagery, white mushrooms are growing at the base of the trees, presumably the linger mushrooms, which themselves stand for long life. Eating certain magical ones even brings immortality. So this is a painting crowded with auspicious wishes to some fortunate person who is the recipient, perhaps on one of his more important birthdays. Fortunately for us, paintings survive after performing their original functions, and we can enjoy this mysterious, entrancing work. Now we go on then to look at the work of another great master, very different, named Li Tang. Li Tang is the next major master of landscape in the Song dynasty. The Imperial Painting Academy continued to flourish under Gaozong, as I say, and some of the same artists who had followed him and followed the court down to Hangzhou were still active down there, and others joined the academy there and carried on the tradition, and generally carrying on the taste and the styles of the Huizhong Academy. Li Tang in landscape was the major master there. His student Zhao, whom I'm leaving out, but several paintings attributed to him that are important, and others, a painter named Lian Zhong I'll talk about next time, and we're talking about bird and flower painting. Li Tang, as I say, was the next great landscapist in the Song dynasty after Guoxi. He must have been conscious of carrying on the great monumental landscape tradition, but under some pressure to conform to a new taste, which was very different from the what lay behind, the kind of thinking and the approach to representations that lay behind the great landscapes of the Northern Song. The idea of more poetic painting, or painting that was somehow embodied a feeling of the artist, or anyway, a poetic feeling. Okay, Li Tang was born in the 1050s. He died after 1135. We don't know his exact dates. And the major painting by him, which we have, very probably by him, is this one now on the screen, Whispering Pines in the Mountains. It's signed and dated 1124, reproduced everywhere. I put it beside the Fan Quan and the Guoxi to indicate that these are, as I say, the three signed masterworks, two of them dated in addition, that we have from the northern and early southern Song period, or actually late, Li Tang's is still a late northern Song. This same juxtaposition actually took place in the Palace Museum in Taipei back in 2008. And here, the curator there, a man named Wang Ximeng, good scholar, curator, had this picture taken of himself standing in front of these great paintings with his family. And I don't have any other slide of them. Nobody was allowed to make slides. He sent this one out to some of the participants in the symposium. And one of them sent me a copy of it. So it's the only one I have. But here you can see behind them, if you ignore the family for the moment, from the left, the Li Tang painting that we're now looking at. Next to it, the great gouache, Early Spring. Next to that, the Fan Quan painting, the great work. And then, to the right of those, what I would take to be an interloper, which I won't speak about in detail, but I'm just calling attention to it. A rather bizarre juxtaposition that was somehow managed for this exhibition. In my view, it's as though we were to put, let's say, great works by Rubens, Rembrandt, and Vermeer in a row, and then next to them you put a painting by the modern Dutch forger Van Meegeren. I think, in other words, that this is not a genuine old painting, but that's one view of my own, and it definitely didn't belong there. The mounting, by the way, if you know about Japanese mounters, this is very probably the work of my favorite mounter in Japan, Meguro. This is the kind of fabric he used in the way he mounted. And I think it was mounted by him at some point. Okay, beside the point. I put beside it just for those who, as a little allusion for those who know, a picture of somebody who would have really enjoyed seeing them together. That is Zhang Da-chen, the famous mounter and so on. Well, I won't say any more. I'll just leave this. For those who know our field, they will recognize my little joke. For those who don't, it's all right to do without it. You can just sort of wonder. Now, back to the painting. Here is the 1124 picture. Now, you see immediately, let's put it beside the Fan Quan again for a while. You'll see immediately what they have in common and how they are different. They are both dominated by one large landscape form, one great bluff. And something like Fan Quan's practice of putting shrubbery up on the top of the bluff survives here. So Li Tang certainly knew Fan Quan's painting, and perhaps this very painting. And then again, you see the foreground down below is a lot closer up. But the whole painting is much, much closer up to the viewer than Fan Quan's. Everything in Fan Quan's painting is quite distant. Whereas here, the large trees in the middle, and the easy entrance with a stream at the left, and what seems to be part of a path at the right. The only human element in the picture, the only sign of human passage, not much less human habitation, is this little bit of a path down on the lower right. Even that's a little bit unclear. In other words, it's something that is simply gazed at for itself. You aren't supposed to go in and explore and move around in it. You can't do that. It isn't that kind of painting, and it's in that sense really very, very, very different. What else can you say about it? Let's start looking at some details. Here, a slide of the section in the upper left, which has the inscription. The artist Li Tang writes the date and gives his birthplace, Heyang, and then Li Tang B painted it, or drew it, did it. You can see here also, well, the distant needle peaks, but also the way the surface is treated. Instead of the raindrop texture strokes, raindrop zun, of Fan Quan style, we see now what the Chinese critics call axe-cut texture strokes, as though, in other words, the surface had been somehow hacked with an axe. And it does sort of look that way. They are made by rather broader strokes, made with a brush on its side, and moved away so that so you get these kind of sweeping strokes, and it renders some feature of the rocky surfaces. You can see down below, by the way, pine trees, and as we look more, we'll see that they represent really two types of pines. Some of them with rounded bunches of needles, and the others, as in the upper left here, with more horizontal strokes, as though there were two types of coniferous trees. I don't know what they are. We can call them pines and firs for convenience, but there are two types of pines. Okay, the next, please. The whole the whole upper section. When I wrote an article years ago on some rocks in early Chinese painting, I ended up with Li Tang and was pointing out that he makes one big move toward, well, better, more visually, whatever, convincing or something rendering of the rocky forms, particularly this one right in the center here. He uses effects of sunlight and shadow. Let me say immediately that it's not consistent throughout the painting. The Chinese never do that. On the other hand, it does. There are parts of the painting, like a line of light along the right surface here of a number of the forms, and then down on the lower, on the left side of the forms, it lapses into shadow. And the main texturing is done on the areas in between. In other words, they're not textured evenly throughout. And this somehow gives a sense of volume and is quite effective. What else, let's see, can we look at in this? Here's a slide just to show you. This is a slide taken at Huangshan, but just to show you these rocky masses, like the one that Li Tang depicts, are real, and the kind of squared forms, and the pine trees on top, and so on. All right. Yeah, and here is a slide of the left section again. The waterfall dropping in a dark ravine on the left side. Well, as I say, it's a kind of painting you gaze at and receive a very special impression. It's not just the world generally, as Fan Quan attempts at least to make it, and it's something you, as I say, gaze at rather than try to enter into and find your way around. And all the old matter of the secular figures down at the bottom, and then the temple part way up. Here, let's see, I think I have a detail of the lower part of the Fan Quan that shows that. Yes, here. The mule train down below, and the temple in the upper right, and the pilgrim, all that is gone. And it's simply something to be looked at in itself. Let's go on now. Okay, here's another slide of Huangshan with the rock fractured and showing forms that are not unlike those in the Li Tang painting. Pine trees seen growing on the tops, a part split off from the rest, as in Li Tang. Here a slide of the right section of the Li Tang main mass, which shows us this effect of light along the right edges and dark shadows inside, and particularly this form in the lower left that has a face facing sort of up and right, and so on, divided into faces and blocky, which gives it much more of a sense of volume than any of the forms in Fan Quan's painting. Okay, here, this is the form of, this is a detail of the Fan Quan upper left, which shows his contours. And as you remember, he has a quite naturalistic way of drawing the contours, so with little projections and so on, which must have some geological reference. And in Li Tang, something like the Li Tang paintings, in Li Tang style, something like this, only it turns into something kind of jagged, almost geometric, as we'll see in other paintings. Okay, enough for this picture. There's lots more one could say about it, but let me go on. Another painting ascribed to Li Tang, which is an important early painting at least, and probably by a close follower, is the hand scroll titled Mountains by the River. This is again in the National Palace Museum in Taipei. I would take it to be a work by a close follower rather than by a work of Li Tang himself. And but I could be wrong. Anyway, people can make their own choices. This is 1/3 roughly of the hand scroll, and in general, it's diagonally divided, with all the main landscape mass in the lower segment, and then the upper segment occupied by water and distance. And we'll see this to be typical of not only of Li Tang, but of Southern Song landscape generally, and much other Southern Shung painting. Here it's the boats on the water, and then cliffs by the river, and on top of them are buildings and trees. Here's the second section now, and the landscape continues to rise until it's near the top by the upper left. And then throughout the painting, there's interesting details of paths that make their way through among the trees, and houses on the top, and so on. Here's one detail of that. And I think you can see that the trees on the tops of the masses of the rocky forms grow out of grassy mat, so to speak, as though, in other words, the tops of the forms are covered with grass and then the trees grow out of them. And you can see here also these two types of trees, the two kinds of pines, and much more active, genre detail, not genre exactly, but human occupation detail, paths and walkways with railings, and actually in one place a dwelling. Okay, here's the last section of the scroll, and as you see, the main mass is very much like the one in the 1124 painting, that is big, more or less square-topped, with separate parts sort of split off from it, vertical, and quite strong sense of light and shadow. The waterfall over on the left, as in the other painting, and also in other parts of it, here is a detail, actual occupation. Here is a thatched house and a brushwood fence around it, and a man arriving back, looks like a farmer with his hoe over his shoulder. And here also you can see the treatment of the rocky surfaces. Here the sun texture strokes are not so prominent. You couldn't do that in a hand scroll, meant to be seen close up. The stronger axe-cut texture strokes we saw in the 1124 painting are suited to a hanging scroll looked at from a distance. This works better for the hand scroll form. Okay then, before we go on to another very fine Li Tang attributed painting, more sort of attributed, I'll show this hand scroll in the Palace Museum in Beijing, titled River Temple in the Long Summer. This is, I think, probably a genuine work, but in terrible condition, so damaged that it's scarcely to be seen. What we see here is the last half of the scroll. It's actually about twice this long, and it's again diagonally divided, in this case from lower left up to upper right. And then there's an inscription at the end, which I'll speak about in a minute. On silk, colors on silk. I'll have them slide in a minute with colors. Yes, okay, next slide. This slide probably exaggerates the blue color. I remember it as being more blue and green, but at any rate, heavy color. And it's exactly this heavy color that has led to the terrible damage that has all but ruined the scroll. This is an example of what, well, I have an article in my reminiscence section of my website on what I use the Japanese term rokusho yake. Yake is burning, and it's a disintegration of the silk chemically caused by this green pigment, mineral green, rokusho, copper compound. And also blue may do it too, azurite and malachite, mineralogically. Anyway, I have an article on this. And this is the very painting that I was looking at with several students and with an old friend and colleague, Chinese, with whom I'd been carrying on an argument for years about what causes this disintegration. He was arguing that it was a yellow pigment. I think he was wrong, and in my website article, I quote scientists and give various evidence for what really causes this. At any rate, it's a serious problem with numbers of Chinese painting. And in this case, it seems to have pretty much, finished off this painting. Now here are two slides, which we can put side by side, bringing it up closer. You can still see something of the landscape forms, the pine trees on the top of these rocky forms, and buildings and figures and so on. Some of it. Yes, here in the one on the left, there are a few figures down below. And anyway, Well, as I say, it's almost too far gone to really talk about. But you can see that the forms, the landscape masses, are of this blocky kind, as though he is showing them with different surfaces in different directions. And this is something that we saw back in Tang Dynasty landscape. And in fact, he is recreating not only the heavy color, but also something of the landscape style of the Tang Dynasty. And somehow bringing back that blocky rendering of landscape forms that gave them volume, which I showed in details from Tang wall paintings. And the upper left here is a piece of writing which is actually supposed to be by, and maybe really by, the Emperor Gaozong. And in this 2 4-character phrases, he makes a little imperial pun. He says, Li Tang Li Tang can be compared, Tang Li Shun, to Li Shun of the Tang Dynasty. So in other words, Li Tang, turned around backwards, is Tang Li, Li of the Tang. Let's say a pun. But he's, in fact, as a matter of praise, connecting his court artist Li Tang with the great master of the blue and green style, Li Shun. So, okay, here it is. Here's the remains of an important painting, more to be talked about than to be looked at. Oh, here again is another slide of actual scenery. And you can see in the lower section here and in some others that there is some basis for this blocky treatment of landscape forms. In other words, the fracturing of the rock sometimes takes this form, and it isn't pure imagination to paint the landscape in that way. Okay, now we go on to another painting. This is a quite wonderful fan painting. I'll talk about fan paintings later, a very important subject in the Southern Sung art. And this one is in the Palace Museum in Taipei, and it actually has an old attribution to Yin Wen Gui, the early Northern Sung artist, but that makes no sense. It isn't in that style. It's a meaningless attribution. In fact, it's very much in the style of Li Tang, as you can immediately see. I was the first one to recognize this and to publish it, and I published it in my Skira book as a Li Tang style painting, as an important painting in that sense. Now, several important things about it right off. First of all, it shows this diagonally divided composition that becomes absolutely typical of Southern Sung painting, and it seems to have originated around the time of Li Tang, maybe with Li Tang taking an important part in the popularity of it. If you draw a diagonal line from the upper right to the lower left, most of the solid matter of the painting is going to be in the lower part. These closer cliffs and pines and trees. And then the rest is mist except for these peaks that rise out of it. Let me go on and say a little bit about the painting before looking into details. Paintings, as I say, associated with Li Tang, exemplify the idea of presenting scenic materials that arouse feelings. This is a new idea, not new at any rate in the late Northern Sung, very much reflecting the preference of the Emperor Huizong, but also larger trends in the painting and landscape of the time. Paintings that capture aspects of nature as it is perceived more fully than before. In other ways, it's a move away from naturalism. In other words, one can make arguments in both directions. It's away from attempts to represent the real world as it is understood in some intellectual way toward more concentration on effect. As in Huizong's Academy works, it's a matter of literary values being imposed on the pictorial, a kind of selected or idealized realism. As always, I'm using these words in a way that is rather unlike some realism or naturalism in Western art. But I've done that throughout the series. Okay. At any rate, this kind of painting runs through the Southern Sung, as we'll see, especially Southern Sung Academy painting, that is pictures of natural scenery that arouse certain more specific kinds of feelings about the world, about whatever. Oh, here's a slide I put in. Here's a photograph of the artist Li Tang painting this picture. Well, not exactly. It's a bit later, and it's a bit maybe a different place. It's Huangshan again. I took it on the top of Huangshan of a Chinese artist, sketching what he sees in front of him. And I use it to make a point, which is that Chinese landscape painting is always studio painting, done in the studio. It isn't done out in nature. The idea of actually painting out in nature doesn't appear in China. I don't know when it does, but in the West, as you know, it's 19th century. It's Barbizon School in France and so on. But in early times in China, and also in the rest of the world, the artist would make sketches in nature maybe, and then would put them together in the studio to make a painting. But the final painting would be done in the studio. Now, an early Yuan artist named Wang, very famous and great artist, has a set of admonitions or advice for painters, and among them is the idea that you should carry a sketchbook or paper and a brush with you when you walk through nature. And when you see an interesting rock or tree or whatever, you make a sketch of it so you can use it later in your landscape. Well, that's what this painter is doing, this artist. He's making sketches that he will use in finished paintings. But the finished painting will always be done in the studio. And here, and okay, this is a painting. I didn't take these slides with anything like this in mind, but I have a big collection of slides of Huangshan in Anhui province that are useful for showing that Li Tang's needle peaks with pines growing on them are not entirely matters of fantasy. These peaks exist, and the gazing beyond them into the misty peaks rising beyond, all that has some basis in reality. Or here's a slide of a close-up of some rocky forms and pine trees growing on them and mist beyond, which is a little bit like Li Tang. Okay, now let's go ahead and look at the details of this painting. Here's one from the lower right, and you can see immediately several things that belong to the Li Tang style as we've already defined it. One is, of course, these two types of pine trees, or whatever they are, A and B, shall we call them anyway. Very, very clearly distinguished here. Another is the nature of the contour lines, which have this kind of stepped or almost zigzag, vertical, horizontal, vertical, and so on, as in the edge of the forms here in the lower right. These we'll see recurring in different ways throughout the work of Li Tang, or Li Tang followers, rather. Yes, just a minute. Now here another one. Yeah, this is fairly damaged. Again, it may be from green color. Here is a closer look at the trees and some of the rocky mass. Well, again, as in the hand scroll, we don't use big axe-cut texture strokes. In a small painting, they'd be much too prominent and they wouldn't work. It has to be subtler and lighter and so forth for a small painting. Next, please. Yeah, here we go. This is another passage of the pines and the rocks with this characteristic contour, and the large mass in the foreground with a sort of shadowy look on the left, and texturing done just at the point where the light and shadow somehow intersect, where texture actually is seen on forms. This is, in other words, just a visual effect. Okay, here another bit. Here another detail. The mist beyond, the tops of the mist are kind of decorative, but there must be some naturalistic referent behind them. And anyway, okay. And here the slide of the distant peaks, needle peaks with pines on top. I've shown slides that show these are not entirely made up. Anyway, a quite wonderful little leaf that is quite, a poetic, evocative view of pines and mist. Something very different from anything we've seen before. Before going on and leaving Li Tang, I'll put on briefly a painting of autumn scene with a water buffalo and a herd boy. This is another subject that Li Tang is supposed to have done, and this could be his painting. It has a Li Tang signature, although it isn't really entirely convincing. This is in the National Palace Museum in Taipei. Maybe an early schoolwork. At any rate, maybe the tree foliage may be a little bit too repeated. I don't know. Anyway, a fine painting. The season autumn is captured by the red color of the leaves, by the fact that some of the leaves are blowing off. Here, I'll show a detail of it, of the lower part. Yeah, here we go. Red leaves blown off. The buffalo is mooing, or at any rate making the sounds that water buffalo make. The boy is getting water, scooping up water to bring for the buffalo to drink. Here is a close-up of the water buffalo, quite beautifully drawn. Its bridle hanging from its muzzle and on the ground, curled on the ground, little details like this. And elsewhere, strong drawing for the trees and so forth. Well, I'll talk about this kind of painting when I talk about one of Li Tang's leading disciples, Yen Ping, who also is famous for this kind of painting, and did a number of paintings that are attributed to him. Now, before leaving Li Tang, I will put on and talk about briefly, and then bring back later, a pair of paintings, here they are, that have been accepted by many as his work, which I think are impossible as his work. Okay, this is quite an interesting story. These are two paintings that are in Japan and were preserved in a temple. It's one of the temples within the Daitokuji, the great Chan temple to the Zen temple to the north of Kyoto. Northwest is a section of Kyoto. The Koto Inn. And they were side pieces to a triptych. The Japanese love to make triptychs and have a central figure painting. In this case, it was a religious painting attributed to Wu Daozi, crazily. And then on the sides, these two landscapes. Okay. Two from a series of 4 seasons originally, but anyway, 2 surviving. Now, the one on the left here, you see a group of leafy trees and then a branch projecting up above, and kind of a twig or branch pushing out to the right as though like a pointing finger. And then you can see a kind of blur. I don't have a detail of this. A kind of blur below that. Now that is actually a rubbed out would-be signature of Li Tang. And the great scholar Shimada Shujiro, once my teacher, I talked about him in the first lecture, Shimada discovered this, not only discovered this rubbed out signature, but managed to read it using infrared photography and found that it was a would-be signature of Li Tang. And immediately these paintings were accepted by most of the scholars in Japan and quite a few abroad as important works of Li Tang. Well, this became a big matter of controversy. I myself never believed them because they don't belong in the style of Li Tang. I'm going to bring them back after we look at later Southern Song painting, particularly the work of Xiaogui, and show that these must be post-Xiaogui works of the end of the Song dynasty. Fine works, and very much to be treasured and appreciated. But next, please. It has a figure in the sort of far middle distance here in the lower, well, just below the branches of the tree. I don't, as I say, have a slide of the signature, but I used to say jokingly that the person who rubbed this signature out knew the style of Li Tang better than the person who wrote it in. Anyway, but it was, as I say, it went on for years as a matter of controversy. The articles that had been written trying to salvage these paintings as genuine works of Li Tang would fill a book, a kind of misdirected book, because I think they're all going in a wrong direction. One Japanese scholar, for instance, tried to extend Li Tang's period of activity much later so that it could somehow include these pictures. And an American scholar, Major, I won't name him because I think he was wrong, argued that Li Tang might have had two different styles, as Liang Kai, an artist we'll see later, had a fine style, academic style, and a rough, looser style. And these would be the rough, looser style for Li Tang. Well, I think that person is now sort of recanted and come around to putting them late, and so on. I think that gradually the belief in them as Li Tang works will die away. They belong, as I say, and I'll bring them back in the late for the late Sung. Here, let's see. Yeah, here, getting in closer. You see this massive rocky form in the foreground. Now the axe-cut sun have given way first to from small to large axe-cut sun, as they were supposed to be used in the works of painters like Ma Yuan, and then beyond that into something that is big, broad brushstrokes, giving a kind of flickering, dramatic light and shadow effect. This is very definitely late Sung. The twisting of the trees, very unnatural. The way the dian, or dots, clusters of dots, kind of hover on the edges of forms without really being attached to them. The next, please. Here, going in. Yes, here is the rocky mass. Well, you can't, if you know how art historical forms evolve, you can see immediately that this is way, way beyond Li Tang and very different from Li Tang. Here, the next, please. Yes, here is the section with the figure in the distance, a traveler carrying some kind of large gourd-like thing on a pole over his shoulder. And look at these twisting trees and the way the twigs and branches are sometimes somewhat detached from them, and the way these clusters of dots, not really dots, but strokes that are along the edges of the landscape forms at the middle right, sort of hover over the forms and are not really attached to them. Okay, the next, yeah, this is even closer and you can see it better, including this figure. Okay, next, the other one is a quite dramatic and wonderful painting of people gazing at the waterfall, a waterfall dropping in a rocky gorge, and quite wonderful light and shadow effects, very dramatic and whatever. Look at the up top here with this great broad brush stroke. Well, this is a long way from Li Tang. Here down below, next please, up some trees here in the upper right, twisting trees again, and one old tree down below with a very strangely twisting long thing extending from it. Next, here is the cliff with its face coming out toward us, and broad brushstrokes taking us back on both sides. Next, please. Here are the trees at the right of the waterfall, and you can see that the twigs are not really attached to the branches, and the leaves, and rather leaves, not leaves, okay. At any rate, it's done in a free and loose style, impressionistic, one is almost tempted to say. I'll take back the word, all right. That belongs to the late Song anyway. Here's the two people on the waterfall, next to the waterfall. One of them, again, pointing at the waterfall, as I say, typically done. Look at this very strange tree at the right, which is, you can't imagine something like that in Li Tang, because we've seen Li Tang. And here is the waterfall itself, quite dramatic, and a fine painting, a big rocky mass, of which you see the upper surface facing sort of upward and to the right is rendered only as streaks of white along the upper surface of these forms, as though you're seeing it at a very sharp angle, and the sun is striking on this upper surface, and then it moves toward the shadow, the dark. Well, that derives from Li Tang, but derives over centuries, maybe 2 centuries, a long time. All right, now that's enough for that. Now we're going to go on, and I will talk some about followers of Li Tang. Followers of Li Tang in the 12th, early 13th century. This, I used to use this as a kind of textbook lesson in style history, as we used to practice it, and as I still believe in it, although it's by no means, it isn't popular anymore, it's hardly done by anybody. But the transition, the move, stylistic move, art historical move from Li Tang to later followers of his, with an artist named Zhao, marking a kind of endpoint, makes up a neat pattern of continuity and of devolution, the opposite of evolution, sort of downward movement, such as I tried to show already for the following of artists such as Fan Quan and Guoxi. I showed works by their followers and showed how what begin as representational devices, elements of the style, become mannerisms in the hands of the followers. Anyway, this goes along for a while in the artists I'll show, and then two great masters, Ma Yuan and Xiao Gui, coming along in the late 12th, early 13th century, transform this style and begin new phases in the history of landscape. And then we have the followers of Ma Yuan and so forth. The Chinese concept allows for this, the Chinese concept of movement from one artist to another. They use a term, yibian, one turn, one twist, as though, in other words, the style goes along for a ways, and then it is given a twist and sent off in a different direction by a major master. This term is used for what the major masters accomplish, how they alter or redirect the tradition. This still falls within Gombrich's basic pattern, matching and making and all the rest of it, but it's a more radical, creative, even transformative process. Anyway, that's very interesting. But I will show now just the sort of straightforward devolution. Okay, here to begin with is a fan painting by an artist named Yen Tseping. Yen Tseping active in the 1160s to 1180s. Yen Tseping and his brother, Yen Tzu-yu, whose work I'll show also, are the subject of a very good article by Richard Edwards, in Ars Orientalis, Volume 10 for 1975. The two brothers were sons of Yen Zhong, who was himself an academy painter under Huizong, and followed Li Tang as a landscapist. And they, the two young ones, learned from their father. Hereditary lineages were fairly common in the academy. The Ma's, Ma Yuan, Ma Lin, came from a family of Ma's who had worked in the academy, and the names, at least, of the others are known. The Yen brothers came to prominence around 1163 under the Emperor Xiaozong, who was the second Southern Song emperor. Recorded paintings by Yen Tseping are dated to 1181, 1187, and are probably late in his life. I will put in here later a section on buffalo and herd boy paintings attributed to him and talk about those. But meanwhile, for now, here's a fan painting. Title, subject is Villa Among Pines by the River. This is in the Palace Museum in Taipei, and it's in the Possessing the Past catalog, plate 85, where I discuss it at some length. Well, it's not so appealing, perhaps. It looks like just a sort of a dense mass crowded into the lower part of the painting, and then the rest is empty. What's so interesting about that? But as you look at it longer and see more in it and look harder, you find that there's more going on, really. That it's more interesting than it seems at first glance. Okay, we'll see details. Next, please. Yes, here. Okay, the subject is a villa, group of buildings, somebody's retirement dwelling, or maybe a summer dwelling where you live when you're away from the capital anyway. Built on the river, looking out over the river, quite dramatically. A wonderful pine tree growing next to it. And when you begin to look in the details, you see down below here the place where the boats visiting, people coming to visit this man, arrive by boat. The next, please. Now here, further up is the, you can see this dramatic pine tree, and also the cluster of buildings. It's built on a rocky knoll or cliff or whatever by the river. And in fact, what would be the courtyard ordinarily is occupied by a huge rocky mass, which is nicely textured in exactly the Li Tang way. You can see the sunny side and the darker side where the texture strokes are. And the building itself, quite extensive, with galleries, walkways, a terrace or balcony here on the left side with a railing where people can stand and look out over the water. And on the far side, you can't really see it, but sort of understood, there is open rooms where for gazing out over the river as one eats and drinks. And then the next, please, here, in a kind of ideal narrative, one can, after eating, drinking, whatever, one makes his way, the two main figures, let's say, the owner of the villa and his honored guest, make their way up this path to a ledge with a railing around it, up here under the pine trees, where they will sit and maybe drink wine brought up by their servants, and sit on these two barrel seats, presumably ceramic seats, as you can see them. This is very common in Chinese paintings, the indication of where people are going to sit and talk and gaze at the scenery. Okay, as I say, an ideal narrative. And then up here under the pine we see more buildings, which are outbuildings of some kind, or where the servants live, whatever. Okay, so it's really quite an interesting painting when you get into it and look at it more, and a lot is going on. All right, then here Yen Su-yu was his brother, younger brother, and we have a work by Yen Su-yu, an album leaf. This is his name written in Chinese in the upper right here, in the Freer Gallery of Art. This is one leaf from a famous album which was brought together by a 17th century collector named Gang Jiaozhong. Anyway, and part of it is in the Freer Gallery, a couple leaves, and most of it is in the Palace Museum in Beijing. Okay, anyway, this is a signed work by Yen Su-yu, and is accepted generally as his work. And again, a painting with an implicit narrative content, which is built into the painting. In this case, a more conventional narrative. In the lower left, the path comes in, goes over a bridge, and you see a traveler on the donkey in the usual way, and his servant carrying the luggage. And they're going to make their way along this path, up the bluff, through some bushes, and into this little cluster of buildings, like a small village, where undoubtedly there will be an inn and a place where they can maybe stop overnight, rest the donkey and eat and so forth, and then continue the next day. The road going on is shown here at the middle right, I mean. Now, okay, among the Li Tang elements you can see, look at this cliff up above in the right here, which has that kind of stepped, angular contour. Look at the pine trees. Look at the, the texture strokes, not much of that. And particularly the composition, which is all crowded into the lower part, except for one distant group of distant peaks and seen in the upper part. The sky is partly darkened, showing it's evening, and the travelers are arriving by evening. Anyway, a quite lovely leaf and a genuine work by this small, lesser artist. Okay, the next. Now, here, okay, I'll put in this one in just to sort of show the later stage, and for our purpose, the end stage of this devolution of the Li Tang style. This is an album leaf by a slightly younger contemporary of the Yen brothers named Joshua Gu. Joshua Gu in the Academy, active in the later 12th, early 13th century. He was the teacher of a much greater master, Liang Kai. He was his teacher as a figure painter in the Academy. And this is a signed work of his, an album leaf, Palace Museum in Taipei, titled Temple by a Mountain Pass. This is in the Chinese Art Treasures exhibition. Now here, and the detail beside it. Now here you can see the elements, as we've seen them, of the Li Tang style, carried into the form of rather hardened school mannerisms. Here's the two kinds of pine trees, A and B, very distinct. Here are the trees growing out of mats of grass covering the top of the rocks. Here is the rock texturing done in a kind of simplified way of the version of the of what used to be texture strokes. Okay, and then two figures making their way into the two pilgrims with parasols, whatever, repeated. Here's that the contour of the landscape form going chunky, 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 as if a very, very simple zigzag, and heavy texture. The whole heavily textured part, super textured in the lower part, and then the rest of it very empty. Okay, so we have taken the Li Tang elements and turned them into mannerisms. The two figures are going to make their way along the path and through this kind of cave, and maybe they'll stay overnight at the temple, which is over here at the right with a flag flying, and then they'll go on the next day maybe through the gate and on and so forth. All this very conventional indeed. Okay, well, all of this, I say, very, very, very neatly, almost over neatly, defines what I speak of as a devolution of the style, from major innovative masters' works down through the derivative works of the followers. This is, to be sure, an old-fashioned kind of art history, but it hasn't entirely lost its value. How this kind of art history works was analyzed, interestingly, in a book by a Yale professor named George Kubler, titled The Shape of Time. This was a book that lots of us read and argued about and talked about, and was really, really very interesting, still worth reading. I should say immediately that doing this, fitting paintings into such a sequence, doesn't by any means exhaust their content or their interest. This isn't all we do. It's only a start. It's useful for dating them and setting up a series and sort of straightening out your work, your body of work. Okay, I'll show up a number of other album leaves by Li Tang followers just to show how this other examples of this very, very fine school. There's a lot of these from the Southern Sung period. Some are quite fine. Here is one, a fan painting again. I'll speak about fan paintings in a minute. Very close to the Yen So Yu painting in subject and composition. I forget who it's attributed to. It's in the Palace Museum in Taipei, with an attribution, but not one that means much, as I remember. Anyway, the path coming into the landscape, into the scene, in the lower right in this case, a man and his servant walking across the bridge, about to make their way up the path to this clearing on the top of the bluff, or the hill, whatever you call it, where you see thatched houses, the usual stuff, among the pine trees, same old pine trees. And then the road goes on at the right again the next day. And down below, well, a moored boat, a few other things, but very, very much the same kind of thing. Here, next please, here is one in a Japanese collection, I forget which, anyway, private collection I think, which is actually signed by an artist named Wang Ximeng, except that Wang Ximeng is not recorded, so we have no idea who he was. But it's a signed work, and it's interesting as a Li Tang schoolwork, obviously of the same period, roughly. In this case, two figures, pilgrims of some kind, walking with staffs, come in kind of the path from the lower right. One of them is pointing ahead, saying, "Look, we're almost there." They are about to arrive at a temple built on the mountainside, and they presumably there will stay overnight there or rest, whatever, and then make their way. Here, the continuing road, which is always there, is way in the upper right here, very strangely moving up and then going through a pass, and the usual needle peaks and the usual pine trees and all the rest of it. Quite fine, anyway. Next, please. Oh, here's a very fine leaf, quite different. This is not so conventional. This is a rather more original painting. Album leaf in the Nelson Gallery in Kansas City. I remember when they bought it, I was quite envious. I was looking for things for the Freer Gallery, and they found this really fine Li Tang style Southern Sung leaf and bought it. Here, in the lower left, we see a farmer making his way over the bridge, making his way into the picture. But the main part of the picture features a waterside pavilion under the pine trees with a scholar gentleman in it, gausher, lofty gentleman, whatever. Here's a detail of it, gazing at the waterfall. Well, I'll stop sometime and talk about the implications of gazing at a waterfall and just what this means and how it turns out to have a quite scientific basis, actually. I'll do that later. At any rate, here the cliff is dramatic, light and shadow, some light and maybe a bit of gold along near the waterfall here. The water colored, and anyway, a really fine dramatic leaf in the Li Tang manner. The next, please. Here's a fan-shaped album leaf, unsigned but attributed to Li Tang, in the Liaoning Museum. It appears to belong here among the works by followers of Li Tang. The style is in some features closer to that of the great later master of the Academy, Ma Yuan. The broader brushwork on the main rocky mass, the way the distant hills are painted, the early evening sky, the extreme compression of the materials into the lower corner. Next, please. Li Tang's distinctive method of treating large rocks with sunlit and shaded sides to bring out volume is kept here, but the old axe-cut texture strokes have given way to a looser application of strokes and washes with a greater air of spontaneity. Next, please. The huge rocky mass, eroded away below by the action of the water, so that it's left jutting out dramatically, may remind us of the boulders, although they're shaped differently, in the landscape of the rainstorm attributed to Ma Yuan in the Seikado in Japan, which we will see and consider at length in the forthcoming lecture on Ma Yuan, which will be a lecture 11A. The old feature of showing two kinds of coniferous trees, one with foliage done in horizontal or diagonal strokes, and the other with rounded bunches of needles, is retained here from the Li Tang manner, but with the addition of broader brushwork, the further branches in upper right, the hanging foliage below. Next, please. A pathway comes down from the upper left, where further trees and pointed peaks make up the far distance. It bends leftward to disappear behind the huge rock, and to reappear briefly just to the lower right of it, providing access to the shore of the river or lake. Next, please. Yes. Moving rightward, we see the Ma Yuan-like row of distant hills and the solitary angler in his boat. He is nicely located a short distance from the shore, where the water is deep enough for fishing. Next, please. A close-up of the man in his boat. A simple shelter behind him. He sits hunched over and concentrates on his quiet occupation. A few ripples around the boat help to define the water surface. Next, please. We are, of course, reminded of the famous solitary angler painting in Japan, attributed to Ma Yuan, another that we will see in the Ma Yuan lecture. And there are real resemblances. Both are details from larger compositions, in fact. The Ma Yuan attributed painting is really a fragment rescued from a much larger hanging scroll. The heavy horizontal cracking reveals that. But the resemblance is not without significance. The Liaoning painting is best understood, then, as a fine small work by some Li Tang follower working around the early period of Ma Yuan, that is, sometime in the late 12th century. It could even be an early work by Ma Yuan himself, but that's only a guess based on style. In any case, it helps to provide a smooth transition from the Li Tang to the Ma Yuan style of landscape. This is continuing with the following of Li Tang, but a very different kind of painting. This is a painting, the first part of a handscroll, in the late 12th century work by an artist named Wu Yuanzhi. Jin Dynasty. This is done in the north. I should say immediately that the tradition of Su Shi, Su Dongpo, and Mi Fu, and so on, the literati tradition, was carried on more in the north under the Jin Dynasty, by Han Chinese living under the Jurchens, than it was in the south. There was not much of that kind of literati painting done, as far as we know, in the south, in the southern Song Court and Hangzhou. But in the north, there's quite a lot of it. I'll show a few examples, maybe in the last lecture. Well, this is a hand scroll representing the Red Cliff. It's in the Chinese Art Treasures exhibition. Suren has it, and so forth. The attribution is actually made by Zhuang Yan, or Zhuang Shangyan, this quite wonderful calligrapher, scholar, great guy. He was in a group photo that I showed in the first lecture. He was the director of the Palace Museum in the 1950s when I first went there, and a major calligrapher and a major scholar. And he discovered that the copy of the calligraphy writing of the Red Cliff Ode by Su Dong Po, which follows the painting, to which this painting is in fact a kind of frontispiece, he discovered that in a recording, recorded and managed to identify the scroll, which previously had been attributed to an early Sung artist, a nonsense attribution, and he found that it was really by this artist Wu Yuanzhi, little known, somewhat scholar painter actually. At any rate, it's a painting that represents the Red Cliff Ode, but is somewhat in the Li Tang tradition. Here's the first part of it, and it's an easy entrance with a lot of space, and then a river shore coming into the foreground, and then here the second part. Here we see the great cliff towering above the river, and then receding up to the left, and then another foreground landmass with pine trees growing on it. And on the river, here, detail, here is a Su Dong Po, Su Shar, and his two friends, table in front of them with their things to eat and drink. You remember we saw a long painting of this by an artist named Qiao Zhengchang, which was a 12th century painting, showing all the sections of the illustrating all the sections of the poem, the prose poem. This only shows the climactic moment. Most Red Cliff pictures we have, and I'll show others, we'll see several more, simply show this one scene in which Su Dong Po and his friends are going past the river. Anyway, here they are, and then up above we see the cliff face. This is, strange as it may seem, it's a kind of graphic reduction into graphic brushstrokes, that is, and more for the amateur artist, more calligraphic, more brushstrokey, of the Li Tang manner, this vertical thing and the diagonal recessions and so on. Well, if you make a comparisons, you'll see this for yourself. It is actually the Li Tang manner as carried on in the north and as turned to the needs of the scholar amateur. And here, down below, is in the lower left, is the swirling water around the rocks and the pines being blown by the wind. Quite a wonderful, wonderful picture. Now, I think I'll stop here and then go on later with paintings with political content. Okay, so much for this one. We'll stop here.